Too many Texans feel like they're drowning. The cost of groceries, gas, healthcare. I'm James Tallarico. In the State House, I brought both parties together to make life more affordable, capping the cost of insulin, cutting taxes for small businesses, and passing the largest property tax cut in Texas history. In the Senate, I'll take on corruption and keep fighting to lower your costs. I approve this message because it shouldn't be this hard to keep your head above water.
Hi again, everyone. It's 5 o'clock in New York as James Tallarico's Senate campaign in Texas continues to gain momentum and rise in the polls. And we'll get into the specifics in that race in a minute. There's a simple takeaway from that ad of his. Focus on what voters say they care about most, and that is the price of everything and the economy. The high cost of goods and services, groceries and gas, deeply troubling to all Americans in the year 2026. But you would never know that by listening to the Republicans. Instead, they're stuck back in the year 2020, relitigating Donald Trump's embarrassing defeat to Joe Biden in the presidential election, making voter fraud, which Bill Barr said isn't a thing, called it bullshit, the centerpiece of their campaigns. Even today, we saw Republicans grilling Dr. Anthony Fauci on Capitol Hill over the origins of the 2019 coronavirus pandemic. Today, COVID doesn't even make the list of top issues on voters' minds. When Republicans actually do address the things that voters say are top of mind, things like health care and affordability, they seem to be trying to make their political fate worse. The Wall Street Journal was first to report on the Trump administration not renewing a subsidy put in place during Joe Biden's presidency that keeps premium costs down for people on Medicare. Quote, the move will eliminate a program that is giving insurance companies an estimated $3.6 billion in subsidies this year to blunt increases in premiums for the Medicare prescription plans known as Part D. The program will end after 2026, according to administration officials. High drug costs are a perennial political issue, especially for seniors on fixed incomes, and healthcare affordability is expected to be a focus in the midterm elections. Roughly 25 million people have Part D plans, and they will learn about their 2027 rates in the fall. So right before voters head to the polls in the fall, many of them, and these are the most active participants in midterm elections, are going to find out their health care premiums are going up. Policies like these, along with the deeply unpopular war in Iran that is also ushering in soaring gas prices, and along with corruption on a scale we have never seen before in this country, attacks on human rights and the weaponization of our government is what Donald Trump is offering the American voters. And, newsflash, apparently it's not what they want. According to a new CNN poll, a record high 73% of all adults say Donald Trump has not paid enough attention to the country's most important problems. This afternoon, a stunningly low number in a brand new Quinnipiac poll, Donald Trump's approval rating now stands at 32%, with 58% of all Americans saying they disapprove of Donald Trump. That 32% is an all-time low for both of Donald Trump's terms in the history of Quinnipiac's polling. Donald Trump and the GOP not focused on the nation's most pressing issues is where we begin the hour with some of our favorite experts and friends. New York Times opinion writer and host of the Fast Politics podcast, Molly Jong-Fast, is here. Charlie Sykes is back. He's the author of the To the Contrary newsletter. And joining me at the table, Democratic strategist and chief communications officer for the political organization Move On, Joel Payne, is here. Charlie Sykes, let me start with you. I know the call and response is he doesn't care about politics because he's trying to cheat. Not caring about politics is something that affects every voter, right? Every voter sees him fixated on potentially manufacturing intelligence to satisfy his bruised ego from his defeat in 2020. But rigging the election is still sort of a Hail Mary. I mean, what do you make of the disproportionate response to political fortunes that are falling by the day based on all polls?
Well, this is extraordinary. We've been talking about this for years, but I've never seen this kind of tone deafness from the president, who ran, of course, as a populist. You cited that CNN poll, which shows, 73% of adults say he hasn't paid attention to the most important issues, but around 3/4 of Americans now say that Trump is not in touch with the problems ordinary Americans face in their daily lives. And what does Donald Trump's administration do? They say, hold my beer. We're going to cut subsidies for senior citizens for their drug prices. And we're going to let them all know right before the midterm elections. Who thought that was a good idea? I suppose we ought to also note that this is the subset of voters most likely to turn out in a midterm election. So we're seeing this pattern where Donald Trump, who has in the past had what I've described as the reptilian instinct for public opinion, seems increasingly isolated from these issues. And although it looks like he doesn't care, look, we know that Donald Trump is obsessed with not losing, not being defeated. But he keeps handing one crap sandwich after another to the Republicans who are on the ballot. And this is one of those stories. When I first saw it earlier today, I thought, no, this can't possibly be true. They can't possibly have thought this was a good idea to do this at this moment. And you mentioned all the other things they're talking about relitigating. The American people are watching Donald Trump obsessing about his ballroom, his reflecting pond. They're watching Donald Trump obsessed with his own ego, his various vanity projects, while the cost of living continues to rise. And what does he do? He puts a big exclamation mark on it with this particular move. It really is kind of amazing for this administration.
I mean, Molly Jong-Fast, I raised this issue with a little bit of trepidation, but Steve Bannon, who I think was pardoned once for felony fraud charges. Yep. I think he went to jail for obstruction of Congress. So I'm not holding him up as anything other than perhaps the source of what we perceive to be Donald Trump's reptilian political sensibility. Mm-hmm. But he seemed to have the role of keeping alive the real life experiences of the MAGA voter. The cost of health care, the cost of gas, the promise to never embroil the United States of America in a forever war. He's either been exiled or kicked off the island, or he's in on the oligarchy. I mean, I don't know which it is, but there is clearly no one around Donald Trump who can even make Donald Trump pretend to care about his own base of voters.
Yeah, who another person like that was Marjorie Taylor Greene. And remember, this division started, look, inflation is for sure a real issue, and people vote on the price of gas and the price of groceries and the price of eggs. And you'll remember Donald Trump had this weave where he talked about lowering the price of bacon. So he did run on making things cheaper. But I think it's worth remembering that part of the Steve Bannon, Marjorie Taylor Greene split comes from the Epstein files, comes from the fact that Donald Trump ran on this idea that he was going to end QAnon. I mean, remember from 2016 that he was going to end all of these terrible crimes that may or may not have happened. And then he's confronted with probably the largest sex trafficking ring in American history. And he pivots and says there's nothing to see here. And in fact, goes back and forth about releasing the files. So he has had these instincts that were populist. But then in the end, he sort of, pivoted back to a very unpopulist instincts of not wanting to release the files. So they do ultimately get released, sort of, and not being focused on affordability. But again, it's important to remember the president is always blamed for the economy, rightly or wrongly. In this case, I think he did have quite a lot to do with the inflation that we're seeing.
Let me show you what voters are saying, Joel, in their own words.
We need to reinvest in America. And I do think under President Trump, a lot of those things have been accomplished. More than 90% of Republicans and well over 70% of Democrats believe that it's not too much to ask to show an ID when you vote. On July 4th, 2025, President Trump signed the One Big Beautiful Bill.
My biggest gripe with you and fellow Republicans is your compliance with this president. He imposed tariffs. Congress imposed tariffs, not the president. You did nothing. He attacked Iran. He didn't confer with you. You declare war, not the president. He talks about taking over Greenland, Canada, Cuba. Very few people have spoken. And my question is, why are you so compliant with this man? Are you afraid he was going to run a MAGA guy against you, or what?
So that was Republican Congressman Mike Flood. This is the interesting thing about the midterms. As deeply unpopular as all of Trump's policies are, there's a lot of statewide polling that picks up even more anger at the members of Congress for both the deeply unpopular policies and their fecklessness and weakness in going along with them. And it started with the immigration overreach. You know, why don't you speak up? Why don't you say something about ICE rushing into our cities and states in a militarized fashion?
Yeah, if you observe this and, looking at that town hall, there's this ritual flogging of Republican members of Congress that Donald Trump's been doing, frankly, since he's been on the public scene, since he's been president the first time and this time. And they will fetch and beg to whatever he tells them to do. Voters are different. And it kind of seems like what he's doing right now is he's almost challenging Republican voters. It's like he's daring them to not go along with the bit. He's doing it on every issue. He's doing it on immigration by overreaching. He's doing it by the priority he's focusing on. I'm focused on a ballroom. I'm focused on a pond. I'm not focused on the one thing that all the data tells us that we know he was sent to Washington to do, to make people's lives more affordable. So this tactic that he's used with Republican members of Congress, he's trying to do it with his base of voters, and it seems like they're rebelling. I mean, that 32% number that you cited earlier, I mean, as Sarah Longwell of The Bulwark likes to talk about it, the Bush line, which is essentially the place, the break point where you will probably start to see Republicans make the decision that Donald Trump's legacy is not worth them losing their jobs. I mean, that's where we are right now. The last thing I would say, Nicole, is, this is somewhat related but somewhat unrelated. If you think about that White House Correspondents' Dinner the other day, and the terrible jokes and whether they were offensive or not, obviously they were, but how poorly they were received. And it seemed like it was the first time he had actually tested the material out. And it seemed like the first time he had tested the material out outside of his small cadre of advisors and sycophants and people who love everything he says. And that actually seems connected to every single thing Donald Trump says. It seems like the first time he is out in public talking about these things, it's the first time he has considered that people outside of his base will challenge him. And that's a very dangerous place for a president to be.